When Dr. Phil heard that whisper, he dropped the cards in his hand, and the studio froze into ice-cold silence. The audience stopped breathing. Cameras continued rolling, but no one moved. Because what Susan had just said, so quietly that the boom operator almost missed it, was something no one in that room, or watching at home, was prepared to hear. "I killed him!" 3 words. Barely audible. But they changed everything. 48 minutes earlier, the show had started like any other Dr. Phil episode. The theme was family secrets that destroy relationships. Susan Mitchell, a 52-year-old elementary school teacher from Ohio, had come on the show with her daughter, Emily, 28, to talk about their fractured relationship. The producers had pitched it as a classic mother-daughter conflict, communication breakdown, unresolved resentment, the usual family therapy material. Dr. Phil walked onto the stage to his signature applause. The audience was energized. Susan sat on the couch, hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing a modest blue cardigan. Emily sat beside her, arms crossed defensively, avoiding eye contact. "So, Susan," Dr. Phil began, settling into his chair with his note-card stack. "Your daughter says you've been hiding something from her for her entire life. Something that's created a wall between you two. Is that true?" Susan nodded slowly. "Yes." "And Emily?" Dr. Phil turned to the daughter. "You say you've felt this wall your entire childhood. You knew something was wrong, but your mother wouldn't tell you what it was." Emily's voice cracked. "I grew up feeling like I was walking on eggshells. Like there was this huge secret hanging over everything, but nobody would talk about it. But no one in that studio knew that within the hour, everything would change." Dr. Phil leaned forward. "Susan, your daughter deserves the truth. Whatever you've been carrying, it's time to let it out. What is it that you've been hiding?" Susan's hands trembled. She looked down at her lap. The camera zoomed in slowly. "It's about Emily's father," Susan whispered. Dr. Phil nodded encouragingly. "Okay. Emily's father. What about him?" Susan took a shaky breath. He left when Emily was 2 years old. I told her he abandoned us. That he didn't want to be a father." Emily's face tightened with pain. "You told me he was a coward. That he chose his freedom over his family." "I know," Susan said, tears forming. "And I'm so sorry. Because that wasn't true." The studio audience leaned forward. Dr. Phil glanced at his notes, expecting a reveal about infidelity or abandonment. "So what is the truth?" Dr. Phil asked gently. Susan's voice dropped to almost nothing. "He didn't leave. He died." The audience gasped audibly. Emily's head snapped toward her mother. "What?" "He died, Emily. Your father died when you were 2 years old." Dr. Phil's expression shifted from therapeutic curiosity to genuine shock. "You told your daughter her father abandoned her when he actually passed away?" Susan nodded, sobbing now. I couldn't tell her the truth. It was too hard." Emily stood up suddenly, her voice rising. "You let me hate him my entire life. You let me think he didn't want me." The camera operators adjusted frantically. The audience was dead silent except for scattered sniffles. But Dr. Phil noticed something. Susan wasn't just crying. She was shaking. Violently. Dr. Phil raised his hand. "Hold on. Stop the cameras." The producers in the control room froze. Dr. Phil never stopped tape. The audience murmured in confusion. "Susan," Dr. Phil said quietly, standing now, moving closer to her. "There's more to this story. Isn't there?" Susan couldn't speak. She just nodded. Dr. Phil turned to the audience. "I need everyone to stay calm. This is a real moment, and we're going to handle it with the care it deserves." He turned back to Susan, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Susan, how did Emily's father die?" Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Susan's whole body trembled. Emily sat back down slowly, eyes wide, suddenly afraid of what was coming. Susan. Dr. Phil said again, kneeling now in front of her so they were eye level. How did he die? And that's when Susan whispered it. So quietly. So broken. I killed him! The studio froze. Dr. Phil's hand, which had been holding his note cards, went completely still. The cards slipped from his fingers and scattered across the floor. No one moved to pick them up. The audience was completely silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Just the hum of the studio lights. Emily's face drained of all color. What? Dr. Phil didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Susan. Susan, I need you to explain what you just said. Susan looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. It was an accident. God, it was an accident. But it was my fault. Dr. Phil's voice remained calm, steady, the voice of someone who had walked through trauma with countless people. Tell me what happened. The cameras kept rolling. The crew was paralyzed. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't rehearsed. Susan's voice was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the studio, every word was clear. We were fighting. Mark, Emily's father, he wanted to leave me. He said he couldn't do it anymore. The marriage, the stress, everything. He packed a bag. I begged him not to go. I grabbed his arm. He pulled away. And he fell down the stairs. Emily put her hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. He hit his head on the landing. Susan continued, her voice mechanical now, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized decades ago. There was so much blood. I called 911. They came. They tried. But he was gone. Dr. Phil sat back slowly, processing. Susan, that's not murder. That's a tragic accident. But it was my fault. Susan's voice broke. If I hadn't grabbed him, if I had just let him go, he'd still be alive. I took Emily's father from her. I destroyed her life before it even started. The silence in the studio was deafening. Dr. Phil looked at Emily, who was crying silently now, then back at Susan. He stood, walked over to the small table beside the couch, and picked up a white envelope that had been sitting there, an envelope the producers had prepared for a completely different reveal. He held it for a moment, then set it back down. It didn't matter anymore. The scripted moment was gone. Dr. Phil turned to the production booth. Can we get a therapist in here, please? Now. A producer's voice came through the speakers. Dr. Phil, we're... No. Dr. Phil repeated firmly. He turned back to Susan and Emily. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to pause this taping. You two are going to go backstage with a licensed trauma therapist. You're going to talk privately, away from cameras. And when you're ready, if you're ready, we'll come back. Susan looked up at him, shocked. You're stopping the show? Susan. Dr. Phil said gently. This isn't a show anymore. This is your life. This is your daughter's life. And I'm not going to exploit that for ratings. The audience erupted into applause. Dr. Phil raised his hand again, quieting them. Susan, you've been carrying this for 26 years. You've been drowning in guilt over something that was an accident. And Emily, you've been living with a lie that made you believe you weren't loved. Both of you deserve better than this. Emily looked at her mother. For the first time in the entire taping, she reached over and took Susan's hand. Mom, Emily whispered. Why didn't you just tell me? Susan sobbed. Because I didn't want you to know that I was the reason he was gone. I didn't want you to hate me. I already hated the lie, Emily said, tears streaming down her face. But I never hated you. The moment that followed was one of the most powerful in Dr. Phil's 21 seasons on air. Mother and daughter collapsed into each other, sobbing. The audience watched in complete silence, many crying themselves. Dr. Phil stepped back, giving them space, but his hand rested gently on Susan's shoulder. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Phil spoke again. Susan, you need professional help to process this trauma. Grief counseling, PTSD therapy, all of it. I'm going to make sure you get connected with the right people. Susan nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Phil looked at Emily. And you need support too. Learning that your father died, learning the circumstances, learning that your mother has been suffering in silence for decades, that's a lot to carry. Emily wiped her eyes. I wish she had told me sooner. I know, Dr. Phil said. But she's telling you now. And that's where healing starts. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The cameras finally stopped rolling. The audience was dismissed quietly. Backstage, Dr. Phil personally connected Susan with a trauma specialist and arranged for ongoing therapy sessions for both Susan and Emily. He also connected them with a grief counselor who specialized in delayed grief processing. 3 months later, Dr. Phil received a letter. It was from Susan. Dear Dr. Phil. It read, I don't know if you'll ever see this, but I had to write it. That day on your show was the hardest day of my life. But it was also the day I started living again. Emily and I are in therapy together. We're talking, really talking, for the first time in her life. She knows her father now. I've shown her photos, told her stories, let her grieve the dad she never got to know. And for the first time in 26 years, I don't feel like I'm drowning. Thank you for stopping the show. Thank you for treating us like people, not content. You gave me my daughter back. Susan. Dr. Phil kept that letter in his desk drawer. He pulled it out sometimes when the job felt overwhelming, when the lights and cameras and production schedules made him forget why he started doing this in the first place. Because in that moment, when Susan whispered those 3 words, Dr. Phil made a choice. He chose the person over the program. He chose healing over ratings. He chose to break protocol, stop the cameras, and do what was right. And that choice changed 2 lives forever. The white envelope that had been sitting on the table, the one prepared for a scripted reveal, was never opened. It didn't need to be. Because real life had written a better story than any producer ever could. The legacy of that episode wasn't in the views or the viral clips. It was in the letter from a mother who finally forgave herself, and a daughter who finally understood her past. Years later, when asked about that moment in interviews, Dr. Phil would say simply, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop talking and start listening. Susan didn't need a TV host. She needed someone to hear her pain and help her carry it. That's what we did. The cards he dropped that day were never picked up during the taping. They stayed scattered on the studio floor until after everyone left. A crew member collected them and gave them to Dr. Phil later. He kept them too, a reminder that sometimes the script doesn't matter. What matters is showing up for people when they need it most. Even if it means freezing mid-show. Even if it means dropping everything. Even if it means the room goes completely, utterly silent. 6 months after that taping, Emily Mitchell posted something on social media that went viral. It was a photo of her father, young, smiling, holding a baby Emily in his arms. The caption read, For 26 years I thought my dad abandoned me. Last week, I visited his grave for the first time. Mom came with me. We brought flowers. We talked to him. And I finally got to say goodbye to the father I never knew I'd lost. Thank you, Dr. Phil, for giving us the space to heal. The post was shared over 200,000 times. Thousands of comments poured in from people carrying their own hidden grief, their own family secrets, their own decades of silence. Dr. Phil's team reached out to Emily, asking if she wanted to come back for a follow-up episode. She declined but sent a message. Some stories don't need a second chapter on TV. They need to be lived privately, with the people you love. Dr. Phil respected that. He always did. In the weeks following the original taping, the unaired raw footage became something of a legend among the production crew. Young producers would ask about the confession episode. Veteran crew members would describe it with reverence. You had to be there. The silence. The weight of it. Phil dropping those cards. None of us knew what to do. The episode itself aired 3 months later, heavily edited, with clear content warnings and resources for viewers struggling with trauma and grief. The ratings were massive, but more importantly, the show's hotline received over 15,000 calls in the week following the broadcast. People ready to share their own secrets. People ready to stop running from their past. Dr. Phil often said that therapy isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and being present for the hardest moments. That day, when Susan whispered her confession, Dr. Phil didn't have a prepared response. He didn't have a neat psychological framework to apply. He just had his instinct, his decades of experience, and his fundamental belief that every person deserves dignity, even in their darkest confession. Susan taught me something that day, Dr. Phil later told his staff in a private meeting. She taught me that guilt is a prison we build ourselves. And sometimes the key to that prison is just telling the truth, even if it's 26 years late. The white envelope on the table, the one that was never opened, eventually became a teaching tool. Dr. Phil would show it to new producers and say, "This is what happens when you plan a show." But this, he'd point to the photo of the scattered cards on the floor. "This is what happens when you do the work. The real work. And you have to be ready to choose the work over the show. Every single time. That choice is what separates television from transformation." Susan and Emily Mitchell continued therapy for over a year. They created a memory book about Mark, Emily's father, filling it with stories, photos, and the truth that had been hidden for so long. Emily learned about her father's love of jazz music, his terrible sense of humor, his dream of building a treehouse that he never got to finish. And Susan learned to forgive herself. Not quickly. Not easily. But eventually. The last update Dr. Phil received was 2 years after the taping. It was a photo, Susan and Emily, standing together at a 5K run for grief support services. Both wearing race bibs. Both smiling. The inscription on the back simply said, "We're running now. Not away. Just forward."